In Japan, you learn the rules fast. Bow when you enter a store. Separate your trash meticulously. But in my old apartment in Kyoto, there was one rule nobody ever wrote down. It wasn't in the lease, and it wasn't on any bulletin board. It was a rule you learned from a neighbour's hushed whisper or just felt in the dead quiet of the hallways after dark. You never, ever open your door after midnight. I only had to break that rule once. I moved to Kyoto in late autumn. The maple leaves were the colour of fire and the air had a clean, crisp edge. I was an exchange student, living out a dream of studying Japanese art history. My apartment was pretty much what you'd expect for a student on a budget. Small, efficient and aggressively beige. A classic 1K layout. Just a single room with a tiny kitchenette on one wall and a sliding glass door to a narrow balcony on the other. It was on the 3rd floor of a plain 5-story building, tucked away in a quiet neighbourhood. The first thing that hit me was the silence. During the day, the area hummed with life. The distant chime of a train, kids chattering on their way to school, the song from a passing sweet potato truck. But at night, a heavy, expectant quiet would just settle over everything. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. The walls were paper-thin, something I learned fast. I could hear my neighbour, Mrs. Tanaka, watching TV in the evenings. I could hear the student above me pacing, his footsteps a dull, rhythmic thud. We were all crammed in our little concrete boxes, and yet, the silence made me feel like the only person in the world. People really kept to themselves. We'd give a polite bow in the hallway, a silent nod that said, "I see you exist," but that was it. No friendly chats by the mailboxes, no "care for a cup of tea?" It was a weird mix of liberating and deeply unsettling. This fear of being utterly alone in a crowd of millions is a real anxiety in Japan, and my little apartment started to feel like ground zero. I tried to lean into it, told myself it was perfect for studying. My days were for lectures on woodblock prints and wandering through ancient temples. My nights were for textbooks and instant ramen. I got into a routine, come home from the university, grab a bento box from the konbini and retreat into my box. I'd study until my eyes burned, with the only sounds being my pen scratching on paper and the low hum of the fridge. It was my second week there that I had my one real conversation with Mrs. Tanaka. I was fumbling with my key when her door slid open just a crack. One dark eye peered out. "You are the new student," she said. Her voice was a dry whisper. It wasn't a question. I bowed awkwardly, my backpack slipping. "Yeah, that's me. Sorry if I've been making noise." She just ignored the apology. Her eye scanned the hall before landing back on me. "This is a quiet building," she stated. "The walls are like paper." She paused, and I thought that was it. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "At night, you might hear drafts, strange sounds. It's an old building. The wind plays tricks." I managed a weak smile. "Thanks for the heads up." Her gaze sharpened. "It's important to be a good neighbour, respectful, and not to disturb the peace." She didn't say the words. She didn't have to. Her tone was a warning wrapped in polite advice. "Especially after midnight, the night has its own rules." With that, her door slid shut. The click of the lock echoed in the hall. I just stood there, the key cold in my hand. Asterisk. The night has its own rules. The phrase dug into my mind. I tried to brush it off as the ramblings of a lonely old woman. I went inside, locked my door, and slid the chain across. That night, the silence felt a little heavier, a little more watchful. A month went by. The honeymoon phase of living in Japan was over, replaced by exam stress and a dull ache of homesickness. The nights got longer, darker. The wind Mrs. Tanaka mentioned really did whistle through the old building, creating a whole symphony of creaks, groans, and rattles. I learned to tune it out, just the building, settling. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a cold, miserable Tuesday in early December. Rain was tapping against my balcony window, a rhythm that never stopped. It was just past 1 a.m. I was hunched over my desk, trying to force the lineage of Kano school painters into my brain, a cup of lukewarm tea forgotten next to me. The only light was my desk lamp, casting long, dancing shadows in the corners of my eyes. That's when I heard it. Asterisk, tap, tap, tap. It was so soft at first, I thought I'd imagined it. Another phantom noise. I froze, held my breath, and just listened. The patter of the rain, the hum of the fridge. Nothing. I let out my breath, just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I turned back to my textbook, and then it came again. Louder this time, clearer, asterisk, tap, 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 from my front door. It wasn't an angry, demanding knock. It was polite, a soft, hesitant, almost courteous tapping. My heart started pounding against my ribs. Who in the world would be at my door at this hour? My first thought was Mrs. Tanaka. Maybe she fell. Maybe she needed help. The building had no intercom. The only way to get help was to go knock on a door. A wave of guilt hit me. What if she was hurt and I was just sitting here, frozen? The cultural pressure in Japan to be helpful is intense. Ignoring the knock felt like a bigger transgression than answering it. I slid my chair back as quietly as I could and crept to the door, the floorboards cold under my feet. I pressed my ear against the metal, hearing nothing but my own blood roaring in my ears. No breathing, no shuffling, just that oppressive silence. "Hello?" I whispered. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered. I waited for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. Maybe it was a prank. Feeling like an idiot, I reached for the peephole, my hand trembling as I flipped the little metal cover. I pressed my eye to the lens, expecting to see the dimly lit empty hall, but I saw nothing. It was completely black. A spike of pure, cold fear shot down my spine. It wasn't the dark of an unlit hallway. It was a solid, suffocating blackness, like a thumb was pressed right up against the other side. I stumbled back from the door, my heart hammering. My mind raced for a logical reason. The hall light must have burned out, that's it. But the timing was just too perfect, too creepy. I stood frozen in the middle of my room, staring at the door. The rule, the unspoken rule Mrs. Tanaka hinted at, asterisk, you never, ever open your door after midnight. Why? What was this all about? It felt like something out of a modern urban legend, the kind that spreads through whispers and online posts, which somehow makes them feel terrifyingly real. The silence stretched on. No more knocks, just the rain and my own ragged breathing. After 10 minutes of just standing there, the fear started to fade, replaced by a new feeling. I was being an idiot. It was nothing, a burned-out light and a prankster. I was just an exhausted student in a foreign country, letting my imagination run wild. But some deeper, more primal part of me wasn't so sure. This felt like a test. Like something had been waiting patiently to see what I would do. My conscience won. I had to be sure. I couldn't live with myself if Mrs. Tanaka was lying hurt on the floor. Slowly, I went back to the door. I took a deep breath. I'd compromise. I wouldn't open it all the way, just a crack. My door had a chain lock. I slid it into place, the metallic scrape deafeningly loud. My palm was slick with sweat as I turned the deadbolt, then the knob. I pulled the door inward until the chain caught. I peered through the narrow opening. The hallway was empty, and it wasn't dark. The dim, fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting its usual sickly yellow glow. There was no one there. No Mrs. Tanaka, no kids, nobody. A gust of cold, wet air swirled in, carrying the smell of rain and damp concrete. It felt colder than it should have, a deep chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I slammed the door shut, fumbling with the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal, closing my eyes. I was a paranoid, sleep-deprived idiot. There was never anything there. It was only when I turned back to my room that I saw it. There, on the wooden floor of my asterisk Genkan asterisk, the little sunken entrance where you leave your shoes, was a puddle, no bigger than my hand. A perfect, shallow pool of clear water, glistening under my desk lamp. It wasn't there a minute ago. It was right where that gust of wind had blown in, as if someone or something had stood there dripping rainwater onto my floor and had vanished the second I opened the door. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't broken the rule, not really. I'd only opened it a crack. But as I stood there, a terrifying thought started to form. Maybe a crack was all it needed. Maybe, by opening the door at all, I had already let something in. The next few days were a blur of low-grade anxiety. I kept telling myself the puddle was just condensation, some weird atmospheric quirk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my tiny apartment, my sanctuary, now felt wrong, hostile. I started noticing little things my rational mind tried to dismiss, but my frayed nerves couldn't. It started with sounds. A soft creak from the kitchenette floorboards when I was sitting perfectly still. I'd freeze, listen, but it would never happen again. Then came the feeling of being watched, a prickling on the back of my neck, a sudden, cold spot in the air right next to me. I'd look up from a book, suddenly feeling a shift in the room, expecting to see someone standing there. There was never anyone there. This is what Japanese horror does so well. It's the psychological terror of what you don't see. I started leaving the overhead light on 24/7. The harsh glare washed everything out, but it kept the deepest shadows away. Sleep became a battle. I'd lie there, straining to hear every tiny sound, my eyes darting around the room. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like a faint, wet whisper right on the edge of hearing. The moment I tried to focus on it, it would be gone. The knocking didn't come back. In a way, that was worse. The silence was more terrifying now. The memory of those 3 polite taps just echoed in my head, a reminder of my mistake. My grades started to slip. I couldn't focus. I'd find myself staring blankly at professors, my mind back in my apartment, replaying that night. I started spending as much time as possible at the university library, putting off going home until the last second. But the feeling of being watched started to follow me. A shadow moving in my peripheral vision, but nothing there when I'd turn. About a week after the knock, I came home late, exhausted after bombing an exam. I unlocked the door, stepped into the Genkan to take off my shoes, and froze. There was another puddle. This one was bigger, and it wasn't in the entryway. It was in the middle of the main room. And this time it had a shape, a long, thin, unnaturally stretched oval, like a bare footprint made by a foot that was impossibly narrow. The water was clear, and it smelled of cold rain and something else, something faintly metallic, like old coins. My breath caught. I hadn't opened the door. I'd been out all day. The windows were locked. There was no rational explanation. I backed out of the apartment, didn't even close the door, and just ran down the stairs and into the street. What do? Who do you call? The police? Tell them there's a mysterious puddle on my floor? They'd think I was crazy. I spent the next 2 hours in a 24-hour ramen shop, just staring into a bowl of soup, my mind racing. I frantically searched online forums on my phone, strange noises in apartment, feeling watched, knock at door after midnight Japan. I found story after story, modern urban legends that echoed my own. Stories of a polite visitor who never forces its way in, but waits for you to make a mistake, to give an invitation. None of the stories had a solution. They all just ended with the feeling that once you open the door, your life is never quite yours again. Finally, shivering with cold and fear, I knew I had to go back. I walked back to my building, each footstep echoing on the empty street. When I got to my apartment, I hesitated at the open door and peered inside. The puddle was gone, not evaporated, vanished. The floor was bone dry, no trace of moisture, no smell, as if it had never been there. The only thing different was a textbook that had been on my desk was now lying open on the floor. I must have knocked it off when I ran out. The puddle was a trick of the light. I was just exhausted. I had to get a grip. I went inside, locked the door, and checked every inch of the room. Windows locked from the inside. Balcony door secure. There was no way in or out. I had to be alone. That night, I decided to face it. I walked to the door and, with a trembling hand, flipped the peephole cover. I took a deep breath and pressed my eye to the lens, praying to see the empty, yellow-lit hallway. It was the same impenetrable blackness as before. I stumbled back like I'd been shocked, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. It was back. Or it had never left. It was standing right outside my door, patiently waiting, blocking the light. I scrambled away, my back hitting the opposite wall, and slid to the floor. It was real. This wasn't in my head. Something was outside my door, and it knew I was in here. The days that followed were a paranoid blur. I stopped going to classes. I stopped leaving the apartment. My world shrank to those 4 beige walls. I lived on instant noodles and whatever else was in my cupboard. I kept the lights on around the clock, which did nothing to help. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like a physical pressure on my skin. I'd whisper to myself, trying to stay sane, but the faint whispers I heard back were no longer my own. I never looked through the peephole again. I didn't need to. I knew it was there. Sometimes I'd hear a soft scraping against the door, like a fingernail being dragged across the metal. Sometimes a sound, like quiet, wet breathing. The knocking never came back. It didn't need to. The real confrontation happened on the 5th night. I was sitting on my futon, which I dragged to the centre of the room, as far from any door as I could get. I was wrapped in a blanket, shaking, though it wasn't cold. I was trying to read a manga, a desperate attempt to connect with something normal. The room was silent except for the hum of the fridge. And then, a new sound. A sound that didn't come from the door or the building or my own head. It was a soft, polite cough, and it came from my kitchen. Time stopped. Every muscle in my body locked. It was the kind of sound someone makes to politely announce they're in the room. But I was alone. The chain was on. No one could have gotten in. My mind was screaming at me to run, to yell, but my body wouldn't move. I was a statue made of pure terror. Slowly, like I was moving through deep water, I lifted my head. I forced my eyes toward the kitchen, just a small alcove off the main room. And there was a figure standing there. It stood just inside the kitchen shadow, partially obscured. Its back was to me. It was tall and unnaturally thin, wearing what looked like a dark, drenched raincoat. Water dripped silently from the hem of the coat onto the floor. There was no blood, no gore. The horror was in its quiet, impossible presence inside my locked apartment. It just stood there, shoulders slightly stooped, as if it were patiently waiting for a kettle to boil. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My entire world was that silent, dripping figure. It was real. It was here. I had opened the door, and it had come in. I don't know how long I sat there, locked in that terrifying scene. Minutes? Hours? The figure never moved. It never turned. Eventually, the sun began to rise. Faint grey light filtered through the balcony window. I blinked, my dry, burning eyes focusing again on the kitchen doorway. It was empty. The figure was gone. The puddle was gone. No sign it had ever been there. But the feeling, the suffocating presence, remained. Weaker, like an echo. But it was there. I didn't feel relief. I felt a deep, bottomless despair. I finally understood. It wasn't here to attack me. Its purpose was simply to be asterisk with me. Forever, I broke my lease, abandoned most of my things, and fled back home. But the feeling followed me. The sense of being watched never went away. Some nights, when the house is quiet, I'll hear it. A floorboard creaking in the other room. A faint, wet whisper just out of earshot. And sometimes, very rarely, I'll hear a soft, polite cough from a dark corner of the room. It's patient. It just waits. I broke the rule. I opened the door. And now, I am never truly alone. Subscribe for more stories from the shadows. The story of the Midnight Knocker isn't an ancient one. It's a modern myth born from very real anxieties of being alone in a crowd and the weight of rules you don't understand. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That the greatest horrors aren't the ones that break down your door, but the ones you politely invite inside. They are the quiet, patient fears that take root in your life, not with a scream, but with a whisper. And once they're in, they never really leave.